So I and others have gathered hundreds of stories from people in green spaces. And I've been teaching loads of people to do appreciative inquiry this year. I've taught about 200 people in the last 4 months. And the question that kind of I get them to answer as their warm-up is, or when I'm teaching them to do it, is tell me about your favorite green space, and then tell me all the ways that COVID has changed it. And like whenever you do appreciative inquiry, you learn things you didn't know you were going to learn. So so I just feel so some of the things we've noticed is the world seems to divide into two groups of people: those who connect with nature, and it's about solitude. Solitude's a really important part of that connection. They like to be alone in space. And then there's another group that go for social connection. And in particular in parks, we found loads of people with mental illness in parks, and the theory would suggest that they're there because being in green space makes you feel nice, but actually what they tell us is the reason they go isn't for the green. I mean, it is for the green space, but it's for the manageable human contact. So they will have really truncated friendship networks, and going to green spaces is a way they can make social connections in a safe way. One guy said to me, if I go up and speak to someone and they're a racist, I can just walk off into the trees and the birds and make myself feel better. But one of the kind of bits of kind of accidental learning that you get all the time when you do appreciative inquiry was in the follow-up question, tell me all the ways COVID has changed it. And the kind of thing people have said is, well, when COVID happened and we were locked down, we decided local, because you're only allowed to use local green space. Local meant anywhere I could cycle in 5 minutes or walk in 15. But my neighbour, I mean, his view was local was anywhere he could drive in half an hour. And so what we learned from that is local and localism is a term we in local government use extensively, but it has an enormously elastic meaning to people. And it's really kind of made us think about how we use the term local and why we use it and when we should use it and how we should understand it. So it's just one of those things that come up all the time when you do listening through learning. For those of you that don't know, our kind of preferred method of doing that is appreciative inquiry. The reason we use appreciative inquiry is really easy to teach, and it's really easy to do, and you get kind of immediate reinforcement through doing it. But the kind of things that are puzzling us, or that we are kind of constantly thinking about, is very often. So the best example of me is when we were doing work around child obesity. So we had 10 children that were morbidly obese, and we taught the school nurses and the health visitors to do a appreciative inquiry and ask them, tell us about your family. And of course, what they do is they basically describe the foresight obesity map. You know, the 108 causes of, they talk about poverty, and they talk about intergenerational trauma, and they talk about early life experiences, and they talk about bullying and failed packages of care, etc. But the people that did the interviews knew all of this because they were already working with these families, often for years. So they knew this through experience. And yet when they did the appreciative inquiry, where effectively they learned what they already knew, the process of doing the appreciative inquiry, the whole kind of sense-making kind of almost made them recognize this thing that they'd seen repeatedly and hadn't really any framework of reference to get a handle on. So there's something about, what is it about these listening processes that we all, I would guess we're all using variations of this. Why does that make such a difference? And the other example of this that we thought about was when we used it with staff groups. So we had a really kind of difficult relationship between one group of staff managers and their workers, and they literally hated each other, and it was a really kind of difficult thing, and each characterized the other as beyond the pale, let's say, and yet they were kind of meeting regularly and speaking regularly. and they routinely ignored what the other said. And then we taught them to do appreciative inquiry, and they did an appreciative inquiry on everybody, and suddenly everything changed. And our kind of hypothesis is that the nature of conversations you have in public management, certainly in this department, was you probably got a quarterly meeting with your manager. At the beginning of the year, you set your targets for the year, and then every quarter your manager speaks to you about the targets, and the staff have really good reasons why they're not achieving the targets, apart from the fact they're silly anyway. And then you get these kind of entrenched positions from either side. And what appreciative inquiry does is it reveals each to the other that they are fully rounded human beings. They have loads of stuff in common, and they all want the same things. And then it becomes impossible to other in the way they have been doing. But with regard to the families, it's really puzzling to me. And I just wondered what people's views were about that. Why is it that, you know, it's very often it's a worker that's been working with a family or a person. I mean, in another, when we did the vape pilot, the member of staff had known this person for 15 years. They had been working with this person for 15 years. And in the appreciative inquiry, they learned things about this person they didn't know, and they were absolutely fundamental to the guy's life. He actually told them, there's this thing by Bruce Lee called Jeet Kune Do. It is his philosophy of life. That is my Bible. That is how I live my life. And this is a person who was street homeless on and off, and was one of those people that's characterized as a dead loss. They're never going to change. And just in the appreciative inquiry, he basically gave us, hey, read this book and get alongside me. And his worker was amazed that she didn't know this. And weekly conversations with him for 15 years and had never, and I just wondered what your views, I mean, do you meet that? Do you have a working hypothesis about how particular ways of listening or how particular ways of relating people's stories of their life, why they change people, when very often the person already knows this stuff, they see it every day, but somehow it doesn't register. Another really good example, and I'll shut up and other people can speak. We did some work with CAMS teams. So we had an eco therapy pilot where CAMS families, and excuse me using all the shorthand, CAMS families, parents and children, we have an urban farm called Pool Farm with beavers and all that kind of stuff. They did an 8-week program in that green space, really just to see what the impact was. And we interviewed the families and the children and the staff using appreciative inquiry. And so when the stories came back, we, the non-CAMS staff, were appalled at the enormously stressful lives of the parents. We just could not get over how terrible their lives were, how small their asks were. What would be your perfect day? And someone said no soiling. I mean, that's a really small ask. And it was really kind of traumatic to read what the life is like for those families that have a really unwell child. And when we came to the sense making, not a single CAMS member of staff noticed it. And we were wondering, is that because they hear it so frequently, they're inured to these things, or is it because they're so focused on the child, they don't think about mum and dad, or but what is it? So, I mean, they are confronted with this on a daily basis. We surely didn't reveal anything to them about the families they didn't know before, but they kind of weren't engaging with it. And it was the only thing we could engage with. It was just so glaring for us. Anyway, what do other people think?
Thanks, Gary. So a couple of people joined as we were going there. So just to set the rules of the game, there are no rules. The point is to share experiences and explore the topic, get the benefit of each other's experience and wisdom. So would anyone like to come in and build on Gary's question?
Might have been a crap question.
Sam.
Mainly because I feel awkward by silences. Yeah, and so in terms of, I mean, I've jotted down a few things from experience. So I wonder if it's something to do with just because, you know, you mentioned about targets and timescales and things like that, that hinders a good conversation. Often it's mixed up with roles and labels, I think, in terms of my role is to assess you for X, and therefore, because I'm talking to you in my role, you now have this label on you, so it's difficult for me to see beyond that label. And the other thing I wonder is a bit of a kind of scarcity mindset. I remember doing some work with a group of social workers where we just did a bit of a sort of get together at the beginning where we sort of spoke about what matters to each other personally, and then I asked the question, what gets in the way of you asking, you know, having that sort of conversation with the people you work with. And a few of them sort of expressed a bit of a fear that they're afraid to kind of really go down there and start asking those for fear that they won't be able to kind of deliver on what they find out, because they're going to have to go away and explain it to a social care panel later on and try and justify this kind of why they're sort of asking for this thing for this person. It's sort of ingrained in that way, I think. So that's a few thoughts from me.
It's really interesting to me, Sam, you mentioned the staff thing. So it's one of the things about 6 or 7 years ago, I remember saying at a team meeting, at the time it went down like a cold cup of sick, I've worked with some of you people for 25 years and I don't know anything about you. I don't know what you believe. I don't know who you vote for. I don't know what's dear to you. I don't know what your hobbies are. Don't you think we should try and get to know each other? And when I was doing some apprenticeship inquiry training this week, and in the kind of warm up, when you're asking people to share and they do their feedback, you know, just the first 10 minutes, people were saying, I didn't know this about this person that I've worked with for a long, long time. And it's this kind of thing about the way we are at work is so divorced from the way we are in real life. And it's a bit like, so there's this lack of congruence, isn't there, between what we do at work is really weird and kind of almost unnatural. There's all this kind of architecture about distance and, you know, staying in your lane and all that kind of stuff, which, like you say, militates against working cohesively and effectively as a team.
Alex?
I feel like I'm going to sound really boring. It's not boring to me, it's really boring to other people. Campfire. No, I'm a bit of a broken record, but when you mentioned that, Gary, about people coming as themselves, it just reminded me of so the Campfire theme I've been working on, I've started doing in my local community space. So it's like a growing space, and it's like a sort of commercial greenhouses where they're all run by local community groups, some commercial, some less so. And it's frankly been quite a place of trauma. I don't know, I hesitate to use that word, but there's been a big split because the group I'm working for has been, there's an attempt to force them out. So it's been very difficult, which has resulted in a council complaint, which has resulted in a recommendation that the two warring groups don't coexist. And then when council will mean to find somewhere else, and they failed to do that. So the situation continues. There's a very slightly weird, I don't know, liminal zone, I don't know, but it's unresolved issues. And recently, the guy who I work with there, who's their farmer, has picked up on this idea of a campfire. We've been running this every other week. And the idea is it's a safe space and you come as yourself. And what was really nice the other week was that it's been growing slowly, and all it is you come along and we talk about the recent nature reflections. And I was excited to see, unexpectedly, one of the protagonists in this drama came along. And it was just lovely to see her. Basically, she was the format, if you like, the setup allowed her just to talk about her connection. And I'm sure no one will know who she is, but it was lovely to see how she was just able to just completely, immerse herself in that. It was all back to her childhood and what resonated. And it was about hats, I suppose. In this group, one of the things people have always said is, I can be myself. So it's setting up an environment where you can be yourself. And that is partly about talking about nature, which I love the idea that we all got a connection where we live, we breathe. So there's always some connection, but it was just lovely how people actually can do that, but also enjoy it. It's really pleasurable. So
you have an actual fire.
Well, we do now, yeah, because we can, because we've got space. Although someone's been complaining about, has pointed out, the air pollution issue. So, I think there are pros and cons to everything, and I'm arguing on the favour of this being. We're the ones who are breathing it in, to be honest with you. So, in fact, you can probably tell now from my voice. But yeah, it's just whatever that means to people. But that's the immediate thing that came to mind. Is to I don't claim to know everything about this particular person, or indeed anyone else, but they've told me some profound things about what really gives them sort of pleasure and motivation in life. So without any clever setup or I don't know anything at all.
So yesterday we were doing another CAMS piece. So the first lot of stuff I referred to was last year, or maybe it was pre-COVID. So it was running going this year, and we did all the interviews yesterday. And the thing that loads of the children and parents and workers cited as one of their best experiences was having a campfire, sitting around a fire and talking to each other. Was kind of reduced barriers between them. And there's something, I don't know, atavistic about sitting around a fire telling each other stories. The story of you is, I think it's deeply ingrained in us, isn't it? And the other interesting thing for me that you mentioned is the conflict thing. So myself and a colleague who do a lot of this human learning system stuff, we've been reading a lot around conflict resolution and radicalization, so the mutual radicalization theory. So it's a paper by, I think it's by Mahmood, and basically says groups radicalize each other. So if you think about Brexit, that's the obvious kind of elephant in the room. The more one side points a finger at the other side, the more that side becomes radical, and vice versa, until you end up with two highly radicalized groups. And then the challenge is how you resolve that conflict. And the other really interesting thing is a book called On Burnley Road, which is about the local council, how they did conflict resolution when Burnley voted in a number of BNP candidates. And the strategies they used. So they got people from the Northern Ireland peace process to come over and facilitate lots of work. What they observed about Burnley was the really linear demarcation of the white and non-white areas of the city. And what they observed and tested was the closer the person was to the actual physical border between those communities, the more radical they were, the more hostile they were to each other. And so we've been thinking about this in the context of COVID, the compliance versus non-compliance, and all of those other kind of, because we just seem to be really polarized as a society at the moment. And increasingly we're thinking about how you do conflict resolution, how you de-escalate, how you de-radicalize, how you kind of build bridges rather than walls. And it's just a really interesting thing for us in public health to be looking at that literature, the literature from South Africa and from Ireland and other places that have had long civil conflicts. But again, most of the techniques involve storytelling of some kind or another around conflict resolution. I mean, it's not enough on its own, just there's a really interesting passage in the book on Burnley Road around that. It's not enough just to hear each other's stories and acknowledge things. You have to do more. But yeah, it's just really interesting. Yeah, conflict.
I shall add that to my Christmas list.
It's a great book. On Burnley Road is a really great book. I'll send the paper on mutual radicalisation. I'll send the reference to Andy, and he can send it. He can send it out. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
Spotted hands go up and then come down. So just to check, Sebastian and then Olivia. Sebastian, I think you were first. Would you like to come in?
Sure, thanks, Andy. And thank you, Gary. Really interesting to hear you talk about your use of appreciative inquiry in the context in which you work. Just wanted to offer some of my own personal perspective on that topic, and particularly that topic of what do we need to create the right spaces for those types of conversations to take place, because it's quite close to my heart. To give you a bit of background, I work in Croydon Council, and I'm currently working there in my capacity as organizational development consultant to enable teams in the council to work alongside their health service partners to set up localities-based community-led approaches throughout the borough. So really exciting and innovative work with lots of aspirations for bringing and enabling communities to start taking ownership for their own health, their own well-being, making their own choices, and enabling communities to thrive through that process. Now, I'm sure it comes as no mysteries to a lot of people present today that this comes with its fair share of challenge. And one thing that really struck me from the previous session today was a very insightful session we came out of, exposing some of the contrasts between working in an institution, to use that term to describe places such as local authorities, the healthcare sector, and the community and voluntary sector, and how those two cultures collide in that process of looking at community-led support. And this is where we're working right now. We're trying to actually, first of all, encourage people to acknowledge that tension, because it's inherent in that systemic work that there is a tension there. There's a discomfort there because people come from that place of firstly othering each other. So I work in health services. This is what I do. This is my professional identity. Someone in a community and voluntary sector environment is just saying, I'm someone who lives in this community who wants to do the right thing. Those are two different languages. And actually, where do we bring people together to actually appreciate that actually they're both saying the same thing? They're just not using the same words. And that tough and long process. And I want to bring in the work of someone else that I wanted to mention to the group, that who, some of you would probably be familiar with this work, Cormac Russell, who is from Northern Ireland, incidentally. Interesting linkage there to what you were referring to, Gary. Cormac Russell, whose work has been centered on ABCD, asset-based community development, which is another model which drives a lot of the work around localities development at Croydon Council. And he talks about going at the speed of trust, going at the pace of trust, which goes completely against the pace of institutions. Nobody wants to go at the pace of trust when you're working in healthcare sector, or when you're trying to deliver against outcomes on a year-on-year basis because you're trying to justify your budgetary commitments when you're in a council. So again, that tension is there, and we constantly encourage people to just be explicit and open about the fact that this is really uncomfortable. Because actually I'm trying to get myself out of my comfort zone to try and understand better how to deliver this for my community. So there's that acknowledgement of the discomfort and mutual acknowledgement. And alongside that, I think going back to Alex's remarks on the literal campfires, that we need. There simply aren't enough of those in our communities, particularly in urban settings. Where are the campfires in our urban communities? And where are the opportunities for us to sit down and tell each other stories? Because actually, if you think back and you talk about the atavistic connection we have to storytelling, Gary, I'm very close to that subject of research as well. I think there's something about the tribal, that tribal behavior that as a human race, we do manifest in many ways. But if you think back to kind of that, there's a sense of ritualizing the process of storytelling, which is required in order for those stories to be told. You need to bring back ritual for those stories to be told. And things like open space technology, I think, are a good example of how we do that in a modern setting, in urban situations, for example. I'm a real advocate for open space technology, as I am for appreciative inquiry. So just wanted to share some insights from my perspective here to help inform the conversation.
So it's really interesting to me. You mentioned the community development stuff. So obviously we had the mass shooting, which is called the Keam shooting, even though it didn't happen in Keam. It happened in a place called Ham, which is adjacent to Keam, but the shooter and most of the victims were from Keam. And the council has suspended all. So basically I'm leading the community resilience space. So literally after this, I'm teaching community members in Keam to do appreciative inquiry, but they kind of suspended all normal activity in that community to enable us to do this really community focused, people focused rebuilding process. And so we are 3 or 4 months in, and they are already saying, geez, this is much better. Maybe we should suspend business as usual in other communities too. So it's one of those things that, I mean, it was a tragic and traumatic event, but it has opened up this space for a more narrative constructions of value in place. And the council have simplified everything. So, you know, there is no, you don't have to do a business case, one side of A4 about, you know, if you need something, or, you know, there's a place called the Keam, it used to be called the Keam Shed, and it was a community, it was a very small community building, literally a shed, big shed, and it had been derelict for a number of years. And we said, people really love the shed, you should rebuild the shed. It was rebuilt in a week, and you know, no one did a business case. So it is possible to suspend these things. And the other thing that's really interesting to me is Andy's comment in the chat. So Andy's thing. Negative accountability, limit the scope of relationship, are we willing to have by keeping us in our lane? So we've kind of come at the keeping in your lane thing from a slightly different angle. So one of the things we were trying to understand, and I've probably got a note around it, I make notes about everything. I've probably got a note around this. Yeah. So is this a thing about when staff are seconded or outsourced or co-located in a different service? You will often hear the home service say that member of staff, they've gone native. You know, they've been so influenced by their host organization, they are no longer one of us, and that's a bad thing. And so I made a note about this. So I'll just quickly refresh my mind. Yeah. So it's seen as transaggressive when a person deployed in another service or discipline begins to adopt shared values with their new team. These values are often different to the home professional norms, and in some sense threaten the power knowledge discourse of the home discipline. I completely love Foucault, I'm old. They're often around things like the classification or the taxonomy or more of problem, or around more flexible boundaries or thresholds, which in some ways threaten the safety of the home service. So if they're arguing for a more liberal approach, a lower threshold approach, that's seen as a, you know, in a person would be seen as the equivalent of an ego threat, but in a service it's seen as threatening. And all the things that we in our kind of collaboratives would see as a really good, a really human thing. Actually, you go to another place and you learn about that place, and that expands your worldview, and you want to take a more inclusive, is seen as actually a heresy rather than an amazing benefit. And yeah, it's just interesting the way things become entrenched, and a lot of it is to do with perceived threat and threat response from disciplines or services or individuals, which again kind of brings you back to why we're reading a lot around conflict resolution, because you want to get to the point where the person isn't threatened by it, and like us, they see this as a positive. Someone has gone somewhere else and they've learned and they've improved their practice, and maybe they'll come back and make you change your practice, and that's good. It's not necessarily a threat, but it's definitely an issue, Andy.
Right. There's loads I'd like to ask, but actually I'm conscious Olivia was trying to come in at some point. Olivia, you still want to come in?
Yeah, it's hard because I guess the conversation goes in so many different places, doesn't it? Kind of like my ideas are kind of in a lot of different areas, but I guess I end up thinking about kind of the process of marginalization and how you get groups with different kind of perspectives and different kind of values and thinking, and then one group will always become marginalized. And I think you're talking about entrenchment is right, because that's a natural process. People have different perspectives and they will value different things based on that, but it's how do we stop the entrenchment of it? And I guess it makes me think, if we look at people that do get posted over to other teams, like, are we picking the people that then have the skills to kind of reflect the shared kind of values of these two groups together? I guess that is it about being more strategic around how those roles are used and thought about, so that it's not just about going and learning and coming back, it's about going and learning and showing the bigger, sort of using it to almost kind of unfold the map of the kind of the greater whole and the bigger system, and how it, I guess, works together. But then I was thinking about that, and then I was and I guess, which then also I guess leads on to your initial question, which is around like, how do you get people to tell you different stuff? And I guess it makes me think, it depends how do you change what you expect them to say? And I kind of, it starts with the person, kind of how do you lead the conversation, or how do you welcome, or how do you start, isn't it? And I guess that's where the campfire stuff is, because when it's really clearly open at the beginning, it's really easy, but trying to shift stuff, people get uncomfortable. And how do we tolerate discomfort and the kind of uncertainty and the complexity, the kind of uncertainty and discomfort of complexity, and seeing kind of all of, how much am I a social worker here, how much am I me, how much am I a mum, how much am I a kind of, so it's really hard to know how to kind of navigate some of these boundaries, and so that's just, it's a really, really interesting conversation though.
Yeah, and it's this the fact that services, so we've done loads of work with services, loads of observations, one-to-one sessions, all there's marginal differences between services really, but they all focus on those tiny differences and amplify those, rather than the 99% of things they have absolutely in common that are actually natural allies. And there's something that maybe it's a tribal thing, maybe, you know, this is how you define your group. You know, you focus on the difference, even if it's a tiny difference, and you then start othering the other group, and you're into this really bizarre situation where, so one of my kind of working hypotheses about the original thing about why did the health visitors not register the terrible experiences of the families of obese children, well, maybe it's because the ultimate end of all that othering is you become blind to everything that is not within your lane. You only see your lane. You don't even acknowledge there are things outside it. You're not looking for them. You're just looking for the patterns that interest you in your lane. And so you actually cannot see the whole situation. And then when we come in and do a appreciative inquiry, and like I said in the talk with Andy, I am really fast and loose for that term. It just seems to put someone in a different space. You're outside your normal workspace and you're playing the role of active listener, open listening. And then they're able to suddenly to hear and see the whole picture in a way they couldn't a week ago. It's really strange that kind of humans are we're just weird, aren't we?
Just to chuck a tuppence worth in, but please folks just wave at me if you'd like to come in. But I don't know if I can quite capture this thought, but I have an instinct that one of the dynamics going on is that because evaluation very typically is external, it's others evaluating us rather than us evaluating ourselves, we end up in dynamics like, well, I need to become competent and demonstrate competence, and then those things actually become almost anti-growth and development, because it's like, well, I've got myself to competence now, don't ask me to do something new, different. Don't ask me to expand my boundaries. And I feel I see this quite a lot in primary healthcare, where it seems to me that the mode for trying to resolve systemic issues in primary care is what I think of as add and refine. So every new conception of a problem gets a new role or a new service attached. So that's adding stuff. And then we just polish existing services. And of course, that creates this burgeoning complexity that makes things actually worse, not better. So it seems to me that it wouldn't be reducible to this, but somewhere in the fundament of that is this problem of external evaluation. Whereas if it was internal, we would, I mean, I think we all want to grow naturally. We've just cut that off. So I'm going to shut up there. I can see Sonal, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Like Olivia, I've got a lot of stuff swishing around in my head and I'm not quite sure how to articulate it, so I'll give it a go. But this thing about kind of, you know, being authentic, myself and some other colleagues, we delivered a health inequalities workshop in our local area a few weeks ago, and we had it was a real, you know, cross-sector group of people there, so local authority, NHS, public health, voluntary sector, and we had two speakers at the beginning. One was CEO of a voluntary sector organisation, one was a colleague working in public health, and we had been trying to sort of identify a speaker with lived experience for our workshop, and we didn't quite manage it, and in the end we sort of decided, you know, we kind of had a discussion amongst ourselves, and my two colleagues kind of said, you know what, we're happy to kind of talk about our, you know, sort of our early experiences, and kind of and see where that goes in terms of the workshop. And it was amazing, the stuff they shared. It was very personal, some of it is very sensitive, but I think the fact that they, you know, as professionals, they came, they brought their lived experience, they were, you know, they really were being quite vulnerable and quite authentic. And the feedback in the chat and some of the conversation afterwards, I think it really sort of switched in some people's minds that actually we need to think about, as professionals, we need to think about our own lived experience when we come into these things. And then, you know, I totally get what kind of Andy and Sebastian were both saying about, you know, about that, some of that tension, whether it's in primary care or whether it's between local authority and health at the minute, because I happen to be working in kind of both of those areas. And there's something about that, you know, that campfire thing, there's something about creating spaces for people to come together and have these conversations, but the kind of the paymasters, as it were, need to recognize that there is value in these spaces and there's value in these relationships, and it's how we, you know, and that goes back to, you know, sort of Andy's comment in the chat about the transactional versus the transformational. How, you know, if we can start, I don't want to start to say we need to monetize the, you know, the value in relationships, but there's something around, you know, social return on investment, social value, all of that kind of stuff, that I think that there's something, that there's a conversation to be had there. So sorry, I've waffled on now. I'll shut up now.
No, it's all really good stuff, I think. You know, it's picking up on that and something in the chat about real fire. So I think there is enormous value in having a real fire, And my working hypothesis, so I'm neurodiverse, so there are some things that I find difficult in real life that so this is a much easier forum for me than other things. But so there's something about eye contact. So people, so with the CAMS group, lots of those children, well, by definition, they have various forms of neurodiversity, and eye contacts are difficult for lots of them and for the parents. And staring into a fire and telling your story is much less threatening than staring into someone's eyes and telling your story. And we've also, through our work in parks, there's something about walking alongside someone. So you're walking in nature side by side, having your therapeutic session. So this was an experiment we tried with a local provider of day services for people with complex problems. And it's absolutely revolutionized their one-to-one sessions because you're walking side by side. So the symbolic nature of that is important, but it's the fact that you're not staring directly into someone's eyes when you're talking to them about your terrible childhood experiences. It's somehow less threatening and more companionable to be side by side walking together than it is to be sat, you know, diagonally adjacent or opposite each other in a tiny room with white walls and no windows. And similarly, people kind of talked about this around the campfire thing, it was a much less threatening way for them to share difficult experiences, I think.
Thank you. Scott, I can see your hands up. Do you like to come in?
I think this is a bit more of a stream of consciousness, and it's not coming back on Gary's latest point, so apologies for that, but it's just,
the world is non-linear.
It's for some reason the word measurement is going around my head, and you know, the words evaluation, and you know, the way that we set these boundaries for people's roles and how that shapes people's perspective on what it is that they've got to do, and then how we apply measurement in public sector and the behaviors that then creates is yeah, just something I'm really wrestling with as to what does different look like in that space, and how does different in that space help us bring our whole self, rather than the controlled self that's trying to apply itself to those circumstances and that way of being measured. Yeah, sorry, that's just where my head is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's rambling is a good way to learn stuff. So because it fires, I mean, this whole thing about appreciative inquiry is you ask one question, you get loads of other stuff back. So so I think I said this in the talk. So what we try to focus on is an idea of value, understanding value, rather than an idea of counting and accounting. So it's much more about narrative constructions of value. What does value look like in this person's lived experience? How can we help them create it? Because we can't create it for them, but we can create the conditions where they can achieve it. And that does mean you suspend the measuring thing, which is often difficult to get permission to do. But so one of the ways we offset that is, so we do all the kind of human stuff that we've been talking about, and simultaneously we measure the savings in the system. So if measurement, my contention is most measurement most of the time is about, and most targets are actually about efficiency, an idea of efficiency, which translates actually to saving money. And what we found is if you ignore all the measuring and focus relentlessly on doing early and bespoke things which create value for people, actually less money is spent, and we can evidence that. And we found that if we can show that to people, they'll forget the targets because they've essentially got the savings that the targets were a smokescreen for getting anyway. So quite often we get away with stuff because we are seen to be saving money, and people leave us alone to do the stuff that they don't value and that everybody else values. So it's just, I mean, it's just interesting, isn't it, that it's all about finding things that work for everyone in any collective. So, and not everyone's motivated by the same things. And I see it as our job as people talk about system leaders. I don't like that term, but because they're unpredictable. System stewards or conveners or whatever, imaginers, because systems don't really exist, do they? They exist in the eye of the beholder, and which is why the boundaries are always contestable. So it's about how we create all those conditions where we can learn what people's levers are and satisfy them, because it's important to do that if you want more permission to do more. It's we often characterize the people that don't agree with us as the problem. And that's the same kind of othering that we're trying to stop in systems. So we need to practice what we preach and try and find ways of engaging with those people, which is human and generous and open, and allows them to feel they're getting whatever their need is met, whilst we're still able to do the things that we think are more meaningful. It's hard, but it's great fun.
In the spirit of it's hard, I'm conscious that we're going to run out of time, and Gary, I can't quite believe it, but we haven't solved the problem in the 15 or so minutes that we had together. Before we finish up, though, I think a really interesting comment from Sharon in the chat box to explore, and also Marina, I saw you were keen to come in. Do you want to come in?
I'm not sure we have time, but I'll leave it for the next one. Thank you.
Do you want to give us a thought to chew over as we leave?
Okay. My thought was around measurement. I'm an impact lead in a charity, and for us, it's always such a difficult thing to work with. We work with vulnerable women with complex needs, and it's always going at their pace. And somebody said going at the pace of trust, and that's how we achieve change and support women to make their own change in their lives. But we are actually absolutely constrained by going at the pace of funding and going at the pace of measurement. And those shared outcomes that, that whole systems kind of is based on are so really difficult to achieve. And for example, we've got a project that is co-commissioned by police, housing, lots of different health, local authority. And the kind of outcomes they are trying to achieve for women, or the way we expect for a small project like ours to achieve is they want them to stop offending, they want them to have their children back, and all of this within 12 months, right? And then you think, and again, all of this goes back to the transactional relationship. We need to achieve this in order for us to get the funding, right? But that's not the way we work, and that's not the way people work. Women,
or the world. That's not the way the world.
Oh, the world, yes. So women will, will make progress very, very slowly at their pace, and but that doesn't fit the yearly funding. So yeah, it's really difficult to work. It's great that we're working all together, but we have people looking at case studies that are really powerful, women being reunited with children and things like that, but they are still thinking about the financial impact that will have, and how can we make this, yeah, anyways, that's my rambling. So I thought I'd just share it with you, what I'm thinking when you're talking.
So we sometimes run parallel measures. So the stuff that it's usually NHS set, we would run a parallel asset-based system. So we have, you might call it an outcome star, but it's unpopulated. So it has as many prongs as the person wants, and the person names every dimension on the star. So it's not pre-populated, it doesn't come with offending, drug use, housing. You know, I would say to Andy, how many things do you want to work on? What are those things? They could be anything. And that becomes Andy's star. And we measure Andy's progress to his star, or Andy measures his progress to his star. And alongside the quantitative proxy metrics, we would also share Andy's star and his progress to his goals and what that's meant to Andy. And often we can show that by doing that with Andy, one, we're allowing Andy the final say on whether or not he feels better, but we're also demonstrating how the service is creating value. Yeah, it's just one of the things we've done to try and create dissonance.
Yeah, we do something similar, but that's not what the outcomes in our contracts. So we do have something very similar, and we work with people at what they're prepared to address at the time that they're prepared to address, and that we measure their progress as how they feel the progress is. But there is that dissonance between what's progress for a person and what's progress for a commissioner.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, commissioners are the problem. I speak as a commissioner.